Okay, well, in this podcast, I wanted to respond to a recent podcast by William Lane Craig. So on October 17th, 2022, William Lane Craig discussed in his podcast an article of mine in which I explained my divine love theory. So this was an article of mine that was published in the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. You can find that online. So first what I'll do is I'll provide some key quotes from Craig's podcast where he shared some concerns about my divine love theory. Craig said he had reservations about my divine love theory because, quote, he said, "It proposes that the love between the members of the Trinity is the source and foundation of morality. I think that's a distorted and lopsided view because, as important as divine love is, it also equally belongs to God's moral perfection to be just and to be holy." End quote. Craig noted that, quote, "I recently came to articulate a position on this while working on divine goodness for my systematic philosophical theology. And I gave a paper on the question, is God's moral perfection reducible to his love? In this paper, I criticized this so-called identity thesis that identifies God's moral perfection with his love and try to show how this is in fact biblically inadequate and does not take adequate cognizance of the fact of God's justice, which is just as essential and just as significant as divine love. We have to include both in God's moral perfection." End quote. Well, in response to a section of my article where I wrote that the inner Trinitarian love provides the ultimate foundation for objective morality, Craig said, I quote, "I think that's a mistake. That is wrong. The foundation for objective morality needs to include both love and justice. So while Adam is right that humans are good when they resemble the divine love in a morally pertinent sense, what about when they're not good? What about when they flout God's moral commands and they act hatefully and wrongly towards one another? Is there no retributive justice on God's part to be demanded as punishment for sin? I think biblically there certainly is. We incur a just desert for our failure to obey God's commands and to resemble his love in a pertinent way." End quote. Next, after a portion of my paper was read where I argued that if God is the ultimate reality, and if he exists as three persons, three divine persons in loving communion, then love is the basic fabric of reality, Craig said, quote, "Now that again is this identity thesis. Love is the basic fabric of reality. That God's moral character is identical with or reducible to his love, and that leaves out divine justice. It is radically incomplete, and therefore while I take his emphasis upon relationality in God himself and the importance of maintaining love for relations, that's very positive, but it's incomplete. I think Adam needs to supplement his theory with a robust account of God's retributive justice and holiness." End quote. Lastly, after a portion of my paper was read where I wrote that love is the basis of morality and it originates from within God's inner life of three divine members in perfect loving communion with one another, Craig said, quote, "This paragraph was interesting to me because it's the same justification that defenders of this so-called identity thesis like Jordan Vestling provide for equating God's moral perfection with his love. And I think that the argument fails to take account of what one's just desert is for failing to keep God's commandments. It articulates our moral obligations to God and one another in terms of these loving relationships, but it fails to provide any account of one's just desert for sin, for failing to keep God's command, and therefore it's seriously inadequate as a moral theory." End quote. Now, I'm very thankful for Craig's critique of my theory. This is how theology and philosophy are supposed to work. We evaluate each other's ideas, we point out strengths and weaknesses, and in the process, we improve our theories and our understanding of God. Craig and I have actually been talking about moral philosophy for years now. In 2016, I actually took an independent study in specialized research, a seminar under Craig's direction, for 3 credit hours as part of my PhD at Southeastern. My work from this seminar for him eventually became part of my book, Divine Love Theory, which will be published through Kriegel Academic in March of 2023. Now, in his podcast on Monday, Craig critiqued my divine love theory for ignoring God's justice. So let me say just at the outset that I wholeheartedly affirm God's justice, his wrath, and his righteous punishment for our evil. I certainly don't want to be associated with some sort of soft Christianity that only talks about God's love while ignoring his righteousness. Throughout my teaching and preaching, I'm an ordained Southern Baptist pastor, for goodness sake, I've often emphasized God's holiness and his justice in punishing us for our evil. Bottom line, because of our evil choices, we justly deserve not only physical death, but an eternal death of being separated from God forever. And the only way to be saved from this just punishment is to trust in Christ as your Lord and Savior. So, Craig's critique of my divine love theory, if I would just summarize it in a nutshell, his critique of my divine love theory was based on the idea that my theory affirms what he calls this identity thesis, that God's moral nature is reducible to his love. However, my divine love theory doesn't affirm this identity thesis. Thus, Craig's critique was more about the failings of this identity thesis, not my divine love theory. It's important, I think, to note here that Craig and I are trying to explain different things. You see, my divine love theory is merely attempting to provide an explanation for moral value, what makes a human action morally good or bad, and an explanation for moral obligation, what makes a human action morally right or wrong. On the other hand, as Craig himself explained, he's focused on explaining God's moral nature. So, for example, in the podcast, he said he's, quote, working on divine goodness for my systematic philosophical theology, end quote. He even titled his recent paper on this issue, quote, is God's moral perfection reducible to his love, end quote. And then in the paper, he argued that no, God's moral perfection is not reducible to his love, but includes his love and his justice. He explained that, quote, in this paper I criticize this so-called identity thesis that identifies God's moral perfection with his love and try to show how this is in fact biblically inadequate and does not take adequate cognizance of the fact of God's justice, which is just as essential and significant as divine love. We have to include both in God's moral perfection, end quote. Now, I do understand why Craig mistakenly thought my theory affirms this identity thesis. After all, I did write that the inner Trinitarian love provides the ultimate foundation for objective morality. And Craig pointed out that this, quote, is the same justification that defenders of this so-called identity thesis like Jordan Vestling provide for equating God's moral perfection with his love, end quote. While what I wrote may sound like Vestling's identity thesis, that is not what I had in mind when I wrote that. In other words, Craig thought I was affirming the identity thesis here, but I was, in fact, not. What I meant by this sentence is that the inner Trinitarian love provides the ultimate source and foundation for objective moral value, that is, what makes a human action good or bad, and for objective moral obligation, what makes a human action right or wrong. The reason why my divine love theory only focuses on explaining human moral value and obligation is because I developed my theory for the purpose of engaging atheists like Eric Wielenberg about the moral argument for God. If you're familiar with the moral argument, it's often presented as follows, at least the abductive version. Premise 1, there are objective moral truths. Premise 2, God provides the best explanation for these objective moral truths. Conclusion, therefore God exists. So atheists like Wielenberg and others affirm premise 1 that there are objective truths about moral value and obligation, but they reject premise 2 that God is the best explanation for these truths. I developed my divine love theory in order to explain how a Trinitarian God is a superior explanation for objective moral value and obligation compared to Wielenberg's atheistic explanation. In other words, my theory doesn't include much about God's justice for the very same reason Craig didn't talk much about God's justice in his debate with Wielenberg. That is, because the discussion here about the moral argument is about providing an account of what both Wielenberg and we Christians affirm. That is, objective moral value and obligation. So I, like Craig, do affirm that God is loving and just. And I also believe that Craig is correct when he said that in addition to divine love, quote, it also equally belongs to God's moral perfection to be just and to be holy, end quote. I also agree with Craig that if I was developing an explanation of God's moral perfection, then, as Craig said, I certainly should include a robust account of God's retributive justice and holiness. But my divine love theory isn't trying to provide an explanation of God's moral perfection or his moral nature. No, instead my theory is merely attempting to provide an explanation for moral value, what makes a human action morally right, good or bad, and moral obligation, what makes a human action right or wrong. It doesn't seem that God's justice is part of this explanation for moral value or for moral obligation. In addition, while moral value and moral obligation can both be explained by appealing only to God's love, if one were to explain, let's say, why God punishes evil, another important but separate aspect of morality, then one would certainly appeal to God's justice. Craig implied this himself in his podcast when he said, quote, so while Adam is right that humans are good when they resemble this divine love in a morally pertinent sense, what about when they're not good? What about when they flout God's moral commands and they act hatefully and wrongly towards one another? Is there no retributive justice on God's part to be demanded as punishment for sin? I think biblically there certainly is. We incur a just desert for our failure to obey God's commands and to resemble his love in a pertinent way, end quote. Craig also said that my theory, quote, fails to take account of what one's just desert is for failing to keep God's commandments. It articulates our moral obligations to God and one another in terms of these loving relationships, but it fails to provide an account of one's just desert for sin, for failing to keep God's commands, and therefore it's seriously inadequate as a moral theory, end quote. Now, to reiterate, my theory didn't take into account what one's just desert is for failing to keep God's commandments, because my theory isn't trying to explain God's punishment for evil, but only trying to explain moral value, that is, what makes a human action good or bad, and explain moral obligation, what makes a human action right or wrong. If I was going to try and explain why God punishes evil, then I would certainly bring in truths about God's justice. Here's an example that might illustrate the point I'm trying to make. I also affirm, beside God being just, I also affirm that God is omnipotent and omniscient. But it wouldn't be necessary to appeal to those attributes of God to explain moral value and moral obligation. On the other hand, if I was trying to explain God's nature overall, then part of that explanation would certainly include his attributes of omnipotence and omniscience. Thus, in Craig's case, in which he's trying to explain God's moral nature or God's moral perfection, his explanation should include God's love and justice. But in my case, in which I'm merely trying to explain human moral value and moral obligation, my explanation doesn't seem to require God's justice. Let me give it one more example here, a fun example, which hopefully will clarify the difference. So when I was a teenager, I had a white and black 1990 Ford Mustang LX 5.0. It was a former State Patrol car before I bought it. It was a very fast car, and I may or may have not earned a few speeding tickets, which I justly deserved, by the way. However, if somebody asked me why my Mustang was so fast, my explanation would include facts about its motor, maybe its tires, its shape, and the little tweaks that the State Patrol did to make it speedier than a normal Mustang. However, in explaining why it was so fast, I wouldn't include the fact that it was white and black in color and that it had cloth seats. While those facts were true about my car, they wouldn't be an explanation of why it was so fast. Now, if I was explaining my car in general, then I would include those attributes about its color and its cloth interior. And similarly, if I was explaining God's moral nature, then that explanation would include his love and justice. But in my divine love theory, I'm merely trying to explain moral value, what makes human action morally good and bad, good or bad, and moral obligation, what makes a human action right or wrong. And that explanation doesn't seem to require God's attributes of omniscience, omnipotence, or his justice. So let me summarize my divine love theory. In my theory, I explain moral obligation as follows. I say that our moral obligations are generated by God's commands because God should be loved, and obeying him is the way that we love him. We see this throughout the New Testament. Thus, obeying God's commands is morally right, and disobeying them is morally wrong. And this just is pretty much standard divine command theory, which Craig and Robert Adams and myself all affirm. It doesn't seem to me that God's justice, then, is part of the explanation of moral obligation, what makes a human action right or wrong. Keep in mind, though, that divine command theory only deals with moral obligation, what makes a human action right or wrong, not moral value, what makes a human action good or bad. So in my divine love theory, I explain moral value as follows. I say that an action is morally good if it resembles the love between the members of the Trinity in a morally pertinent sense, and is morally bad if it doesn't. This is almost exactly how Robert Adams' theory, which Craig affirms, explains moral value, except that Adams says an action is morally good if it resembles God's moral nature in general, whereas I specify if it resembles the love between the members of the Trinity. Craig himself even affirmed this in the podcast when he said that I, Adam Johnson, am, quote, right that humans are good when they resemble this divine love in a morally pertinent sense, end quote. Thus, while God is just, his justness isn't part of the explanation of what makes a human action good or bad. So let me reiterate once again that I agree with Craig's point that when explaining God's moral nature, it's important to include his love and his justice. In fact, in my forthcoming book, Divine Love Theory, that I finished writing back in 2020, I wrote that, quote, a qualifying comment may be pertinent here. While it's important not to ignore the inter-Trinitarian relationships, it's also incorrect to say that all of morality is grounded solely in these loving relationships, because though they're essential to God, they're only one essential aspect of God. It'd be inaccurate to separate off this one particular aspect of God and claim that all of morality is based only on this one aspect, end quote. So in this book, I do discuss God's justice, and that I spend 2 sections actually explaining how we're morally accountable to God. In these sections, I argue that my divine love theory provides required elements for objective morality that Wielenberg's theory does not provide, namely a social context for moral obligation and a personal authority at the head of the chain of moral obligation. In this section, in the second section of my book, I wrote that, quote, Immanuel Kant argued that in order for us to have moral obligations, there must be a head at the chain of moral obligation who is completely independent, without needs, and unlimited in power. Kant was explicit about this in his Critique of Practical Reason, where he wrote that, quote, the moral law leads through the concept of the highest good as the object and final end of pure practical reason, to religion, that is, to the recognition of all duties as divine commands, not as sanctions, that is, chosen and in themselves contingent ordinances of another's will, but as essential laws of every free will in itself, which must nevertheless be regarded as commands of a supreme being, because only from a will that is morally perfect, holy, and beneficent, and at the same time all-powerful, and so through harmony with this will, can we hope to attain the highest good, which the moral law makes it our duty to take as the object of our endeavors, end quote, from Kant. Continuing my quote from my book, Divine Love Theory. From this, we can see then that Kant added the following requirements for the head of the moral kingdom. This head must be the supreme being, morally perfect and all-powerful. According to Kant, then, for us to have real moral duties, there must be someone, a head, so to speak, a morally perfect head, at the end of this chain of moral obligation. And as Kant says, perfect and holy, end quote. In my book, I go on to argue that, quote, Wielenberg's model is lacking because it's implausible to think that circumstances, natural events, situational factors, abstract objects, or even moral principles could, by themselves, apart from God, generate moral obligations. We're obligated not to impersonal things, but to persons. In an impersonal universe with no personal authority at the head of the moral kingdom, there'd be no one we'd be guilty before and accountable to. Additionally, our human-to-human personal relationships alone, while important, are not sufficient enough to generate objective moral obligations because other humans don't have ultimate authority over us. Alternatively, an ultimate personal moral authority, such as a holy triune God, provides much greater warrant for thinking we really do have objective moral obligations. Therefore, because a personal authority at the head of the chain of moral obligation is required for morality to be objective, and since my divine love theory contains this element while Wielenberg's theory does not, my theory is a superior explanation for objective morality compared to Wielenberg's, end quote. To summarize, it's clear Craig strongly opposes this identity thesis and argues against it. This idea that God's moral perfection can be reduced to merely his love. But my divine love theory doesn't affirm this identity thesis. So Craig's case against it doesn't really apply towards my divine love theory. Interestingly, to me, Craig said that proponents of this identity thesis affirm that, quote, God's moral character is identical with or reducible to his love, and that leaves out divine justice, end quote. Now, I haven't yet read very much by proponents of this identity thesis, but I wonder if maybe, at least for some of them, that they actually don't leave out justice completely, but are merely claiming that God's justice ultimately flows from his love. In other words, I think this whole conversation about this identity thesis raises an interesting issue about whether love and justice are separate attributes of God, or if one of these attributes is merely an extension of the other. I look forward to exploring this issue further. Regardless, Craig's critique of my divine love theory, that he said it fails to include God's justice, doesn't really apply to my theory, because my theory's only trying to explain moral value, what makes a human action good or bad, and moral obligation, what makes a human action right or wrong. And it doesn't seem to me that God's justice is required for that explanation. However, if, as I keep saying, if one were to explain why God punishes evil, or if one were to try to explain, as Craig is trying to do, God's moral nature or God's moral perfection, then that explanation certainly would require discussing both God's love and his justice.